How's it going, everyone? And welcome to the Bot Podcast, where we interview movers, shakers, and innovators and talk all things conversational user interfaces. I'm your host, Chad Oda. And today we're very privileged to have Julian Harris, who is the head of technology research at CognitionX. Julian's focus at CognitionX is to foster an ecosystem around chatbots and natural language processing, aggregate actionable insights, distill and codify the information, and make the personalized insights easily accessible. Julian has also started 3 companies and has held several technical leadership roles over the course of his career, most recently in the UK government and at Google. So at that, Julian, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chad. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise. So before we get started, I always like to ask a rather unique question based on our guest background. So I saw actually that back in the 90s, you were a researcher at Auckland University. And you and your friend were working on some software based on Mac's GUI library, and you guys were building something called Screen Manager. So I was so curious about this because can you tell me about maybe any similarities between the emergence of UX then and now? And do you see any patterns associated with that in regards to, chatbots and voice?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the one link is that I've always been intensely curious about marrying people with computers, and that particular library was really an attempt to try and bring the richness of a Mac user experience in a really simple and easy way. And the Mac to me was really quite an extraordinary platform because it really opened my eyes to a whole new frontier of what a computer experience could be. So I think there's an interesting parallel there, because if we think about the transformation of that interaction between people and computers, having a screen that made some sense is a pretty fundamental shift from the command line interfaces that were in existence prior to that. So the voice first, or the natural language driven experience, in some ways is a similar level of kind of tectonic shift in how we can access computers and interact with them.
Cool. No, absolutely. That was so curious to me because, just with your background, and you were doing artificial intelligence research way back in the 90s, actually when I was born, so you just have this wealth of information to be able to watch these trends sort of manifest and develop and evolve over time. So I thought that was pretty cool. So sort of transitioning a little bit, why don't you talk a little bit about what CognitionX is doing and, maybe what market opportunity they're looking to address in regards to chatbots and voice?
Yeah, great. So CognitionX, we're a London startup, and we want to reinvent how people do technology research. We believe that there is a great opportunity to provide a new way of accessing information in a more timely and more up-to-date and more accessible way, using today's technologies, using all of the things that are now available. We have a lot of companies who've been doing this for a very long time, and they're very successful, and people get great value from it. What we're finding is there's new opportunities. And so an example of that is, one of our headlines is that we want to provide a real-time advice platform for all things AI. And we're taking a very, I guess one could say cautious, but equally, I think, fairly well-established model for how to try business ideas. Is you take a piece, you prove it, and you repeat as you scale. So you scale success. So we bootstrapped this with the first cut of this has been the impact of AI on human resources. And that's been led by my colleague, Ian Bailey, who's a senior executive at Cisco for 10 years and has some experience with implementation of AI in HR. And he has led the charge on that. And now I've been given this great opportunity to look at and create a research subscription around the impact of conversational computing and natural language processing on business. And to that extent, the vision there is that, it is a space where all interactions with users, that's customers, prospects, staff, candidates, partners, everyone who interacts with the digital part of your business, there's an opportunity for transformation using natural language computing or natural language processing. And so this is one step. There will next quarter, next month, and actually next quarter and next month, July, we're going to be launching that service. And that service is going to be delivered monthly, and we'll have a number of things delivered. We'll have an insight report. There'll be interviews from people all over the world and their success and chatbots from a business point of view. And so, it's really an exciting job because I get to talk to people just today. Well, in the last couple of days, I talked to people from Bangkok, from Réunion next to Mauritius, from Ethiopia, from Egypt, from all over the world, and their success deploying natural language computing solutions for businesses and what the real impact of that has been. And we are not going to stop there. We are going to expand and use the model we have. Those who are familiar with the eMyth and the eMyth Manager, these are well-established sort of management books. The principle is take parts of your business and treat it as a franchise. And so you're looking at codifying, try something out, have a hypothesis for how that process works. And then once you've got stable bits, you can script it, you can codify it. Now, I would say actually in this day and age, something that immediately you're probably thinking, and also viewers there, is that there's a natural next step, which is you automate. So you prototype your business process, you codify the business process so someone else can do it, or parts of it, or augment with parts. And then the third stage is around automating parts of that. So that's actually the other reason why I was quite excited to step into a senior role at a startup where there's a blank slate, where you can say, how do we design a business, for 2018? How does that work? And that's very interesting because if you have any perspective, or once you're up to date or familiar with the principles of data science and machine learning, how you take examples and see patterns in those examples in subsequent data, and that's really what the essence is. Applying that to business processes is quite interesting, and taking a data-driven view to how you design your business is well established in many companies. Google and Amazon have been doing this for a very, very long time. But the tools now available for people to do this in quite small companies is really becoming, making it a lot easier. And so we've got these two, and we're going to be expanding. And so there's the job, and then there's the meta job, which is, okay, this works, and let's assume for the sake of everything that it will, and we get great success in the coming months, that we'll start saying, well, what's the pattern and what's the new area? We're looking at different aspects like financial services, we're looking at blockchain, we're looking at customer services. So, and all of these facets are driven really by customer demand, where we've got senior leaders, often of large companies who run, have offices all over the world, that those companies are saying, we need a strategy. And the strategy, we need to have some traction to start with. And so we can help them bootstrap that, and then we have the resources we want to build in the system to make that really easily accessible at different levels of participation. And so if we talk a little bit about the offering from the value point of view, we have a directory. So if you go to directory.cognitionx.com, you'll see a directory of HR products that have an AI capability. And there's about 350 products. As far as we're understanding, that's the most comprehensive list there is, and we actively maintain that. And when we launch the chatbot offering, we'll have a chatbot directory for chatbot builders and builder technology. And we're going to have articles and a number of other resources. And so that people can go there as a place which will be free for you to be able to get access to this information. And then we have layers on top of that. So we're going to have a subscription as the value becomes more tied to your world, more personalized, more relevant. Then we believe that that's worth paying for. And so we have a subscription service for premium access, gives you access to the insight from that space and from case studies and interviews. And equally, we also have additional services we can offer as a research institute to help people bootstrap these conversations. But we're not a consulting firm. That's quite an important thing to underscore, because it's actually a common conversation we start off with is, you have a consulting company. In fact, that's one of the conversations you and I had, Chad, was, are you a consultant? And it was like, no, we bring customers who are looking for this to the people who can solve the problem. And while we can educate and provide a wide breadth of information and a baseline of perspective, the output of what we do is then say, great, we need to engage. We need to work with someone, a solution provider or a product provider, to actually then bring all that together and solve it for us. And that's what we do. And so equally, when we partner with solution providers and product providers and find those great case studies of business impact, and we can then also sometimes have panels where people have conversations, are an educator in the space, and then say, here is a deep dive with a specific practitioner in a specific space that solved a specific problem that's relevant to that customer. And then we say, no, you two talk if you like. It's an option to connect. And we don't have a commercial wrapper around that piece. We believe the value and we're committed to bringing value on the person who subscribes to that service in the first place.
Yeah, no, I completely love the business model. I think it's definitely disruptive in the sense when we look at like conventional analyst firms, and what you guys are almost trying to do is like, it's almost like open sourcing the information, right? We're going out there and we're like aggregating all these great use cases and case studies to help like facilitate and foster this community. But on top of that, now we have these very actionable insights. If I'm like a pharmaceutical company, I'm looking to leverage chatbots, and I can go to someone like you guys and get that information that's very tactical, not just at a high level telling me in these analyst reports, yeah, conversational, user, platforms are going to be the next level, right? And this very like, blanket statement, but I can get very, very tactical information for my specific needs. So I think it's really incredible what you guys are doing. And, in some way, shape or form, my goal also is to try and foster that. So I think it's really cool that you guys have built this into this ecosystem. That you guys are really pioneering at this point. And, I can tell you this, I will definitely be one of the first subscribers when you guys release this platform in a couple months here. So definitely keep me in the loop for that.
Great. Actually, thank you. It's very kind of you, Chad. I think there's actually one you mentioned a couple of times, and I realized, and I've been thinking about your use of the word tactical, and I wanted to sort of add a nuance to that, because I think it's a really good message. And there's a couple of words that we found that may be slightly closer to what we're trying to achieve. And so one of them is targeted, and personalized, and also, but that could be strategic. So rather than saying this is a small increment, like, hey, you should try multiple intents, which is one of the articles I recently, there's an element of making it relevant. So your example was really good. So it's like pharmaceuticals, in Europe, what's success look like in conversational computing, or how NLP is being used? Then that's a pretty broad question. Or equally, slicing it the other way, what's leading practice for lead generation in finance? And so what's really, really exciting about today's technology is that, I just had a great conversation this week with a provider in Bangkok who's doing really interesting things in that space. And to me, that the exciting thing is that I love this work, but it's also really, really time consuming. And to keep it up to date, this is like a snapshot of what things were. Someone's crowdsourced some material, that's great. And that's a snapshot, and that will then eventually have a shelf life that'll fade into increasingly, unclear value. So there's this element of, by putting a business wrapper around this, we're committed to this not only being there, but it's being maintained. So you can then trust it and say, well, that's the go-to place for accessing facets. One of the interesting insights about this actually is, from an experience point of view, it's quite fascinating. We have things tagged. So I'll tag a product against, say, customer services, or again, it might be, say, retail, and it might be a specific use case around that. It could be payments or something. What's really interesting is that we're trying to find a way that provides really good value, but is equally very easy to scale. And the interesting thing is that for consumption, tagging and categorization turns out to be the thing, which you just see this interface. It just has a couple of buttons, and you go, well, is there any value there? Well, actually, there's an immense amount of value in that. If you know that product is specifically around customer acquisition, or it's about CV screening, that knowledge, I mean, it took us ages to figure that out. Often then you have to sign up for the demo, you have to interview them because they won't necessarily present it in that way. But our whole system is focusing around these topics. So imagine you go there, and this is very much going to be possible in the coming weeks and months. You go there and say, what's best practice with conversation design? And so you search for that, and then we're going to use natural language processing to be able to find conversation design and then connect it to the concept or intent or entity of, depending on your model, of conversation design, and then hook everything else to it. The articles, and we curate a lot of articles. We have over 300 feeds, and we have 700 articles that have long shelf life in our archive that are going to be published that you can access. We have products, organizations. We're going to be adding more and more of these things, so you have this all things AI space. And the interesting thing there is that when you're focusing your entire experience on a topic, you get this interesting view because now you've got at your fingertips all of this information. And on top of that, the other thing that in many situations I don't really talk too much about because it's actually a pretty complex idea, but imagine then if you had a question, you say, what's best practice in conversation design? So you have a list of all the products which are about conversation design ranked by some algorithms that we have that are proprietary based on various signals. And equally, we've got very early experiments being run now with an expert network as well. And so when you sign up as an expert in our platform, you can tag yourself as an expert and make that claim against topics, and then you would get notified when those things come up. And so equally, you could then get an experience of, okay, I've got not only the articles that are curated and high quality about in the space, none of the kind of press releases that say nothing or the concepts that say nothing. This is like practical advice or insights or, forecasting or trends or things that really are of substance. And then you have a list of people who are available. And, some of them might be online now. So you could be like, okay, well, have a conversation around that. And that's been part of that brokerage, is to bring things together from the topic point of view. So the exciting thing there is that that's a way that we think is actually very valuable for researching. So there's an ecosystem that will have different levels of value. And so some of these conversations that may attract a charge, we're still working out the commercialization of that. But anyone who's interested in being an early participant in these experiments, do let me know, because we are very much early stages in that. But what we're getting so far is some really positive signals around the nature of the questions that come through and where the value is. And I think one quote was recently that was incredibly valuable. It would have taken me days to find that information had I done a normal search in different ways. So this is a pretty exciting indication of a topic-based research and advice platform that can be real time, that has an increasingly scalable network of people who are really passionate about a topic. And certainly for those watching, I've certainly experienced a lot of real goodwill and enthusiasm and passion in the chatbot community around the world. There's certainly a lot of excitement. And seeing that opportunity for them to potentially have that as both a way to contribute and help people, but equally we do want to provide a commercial framework around that so you could even monetize that. So we've been talking about micro consulting, and a term that I've not seen used so much, but I call it nano consulting, because, classic example happened recently, which is a real world example. One of our founders took a call from a senior executive out of a sales pitch. He literally said, I'll be back in a sec. He came out of the meeting and he said, these guys say they only do X and Y in the world. Is this true? And he said, I'll get back to you. And then sent him a text a few minutes later saying, there's actually 3 other companies who do this. That's like the white glove service, because he's making a phone call. But Can you imagine the value that guy, that's a strategic, he's changed that whole conversation. We want to bottle that and make that available for everyone, so that you could be in a taxi going to a pitch and you just ping and you ask CognitionX, hey, what is going on in the chatbot space for, West Africa, or what's best practice? And we'll be like, well, we do actually know that. And we can answer. Equally, we can say, this is the best way to answer this now, or such like. So having that real time is interesting, but at the same time, while you have good access, we want that to be of lasting value. So we're not news chasers or news hounds. The fact that, IBM made an announcement recently about what they've been doing with the, what their health team or something related to Alexa launching in Spain and Italy. I know these things and it's interesting, but these are very short shelf life things. They're like, whether I know this now or in a few days is not that important, but what's interesting is the implications of that and what it means for the overall landscape.
Absolutely. No, I think this is a significantly compelling solution, just to be able to, have all of this information at your fingertips. And, because like right now we look at it, it's like there's articles here, there's Facebook groups here, there's videos here. Now, what is actually really tangible and useful out of all that information, right? And also, how easily accessible is it for me to go out and reach out and find something that is actually beneficial to me today? So I'm incredibly looking forward to the release of this platform. And, I look forward to using the Alexa skill. I'm assuming you guys have it in the works on the roadmap somewhere. I'll be the first one to test that for sure. So that's all like incredible stuff. And, sort of segueing a little bit from that, because I know you've been talking to some incredible people and, you've been hearing about a lot of really great case studies and use cases. Can you maybe talk about some of like the really compelling use cases or case studies? Because I think you had mentioned Autodesk on our last call and you were like so like animated and energized about it. Love to hear about some of those.
Yeah, so that's actually a great one to start with. So yeah, the great privilege I have is to have conversations with people who are actually doing this stuff at a scale that I have never done in most cases, and equally being able to have some background on the territory has then been very useful to arm me with ways of quickly extracting insight from those conversations, the whys and the wherefores or the impact. So yeah, I mean, Autodesk is a really interesting one. So Rachel Reckart is the director of, let's see if I get her title right, machine automation. And so her job for the last few years has been to essentially augment their support team so that they can scale dramatically with a non-linear footprint. So as it grows a certain size, that the cost base of supporting that customer base doesn't grow with the same amount. She can obviously tell a story vastly better than I can, but the essence that really lit me up was the scale and the sophistication of their solution. So Autodesk, their solution, they not only were able to implement a conversational interface for customer support that can deal with hundreds of thousands of queries a month. And queries, I'm talking about conversations, not just queries, like a conversation, but also they matched the same level of customer satisfaction as their all-human team, and with a team that is roughly 10% of the size. And so this is interesting because that's a very important metric, like what's the customer experience? And they have an incredibly sophisticated program for measuring these things. What's really interesting, and as a Kiwi that I'm particularly proud of, is that they went past that. And I'm going to slip into a little sidebar and talk briefly about the way that CognitionX measures the quality of a chatbot. And basically, if we look at traditional user interfaces, the difference between what a natural language interface, voice or text, offer is better handling ambiguity, better handling conversation, and better handling emotion. And so, meeting the CSAT, the customer satisfaction of the all-human team, is that's, you're already acing it, right? You're doing perfectly well. You're getting the handling ambiguity well, and you're handling conversation. By the way, this team's it's not like it's doing all of the work. This bot would broker very quickly to people appropriately, and there's certain percentages that I can't remember whether I remember or I'm even allowed to divulge, but it was a pretty high level, and they did bring people in, but the scale factor is very interesting. But the emotional component was done to a certain extent, various experimentations, but the real breakthrough is when they've just launched the avatar, which is a 3D avatar that was created by the same company who created The Lord of the Rings. The Weta studio team, or parts of Weta, left and created this thing. Soul Machine's a New Zealand company. So Mark Sagar and his team have created Ava for Autodesk. And what's interesting is that they're now measuring increased satisfaction over the all-human team with this 3D avatar. And there's two really interesting stories in CogX 18 about this. One, which we can put in the show notes on this. One is a link to Rachel presenting her story around the ethical design components. The second part is we had an advanced chatbot design session where Rachel presented some more details around this. Now, I will be including a summary of these points in our primer that you get as part of the free subscription. And one of the case studies that we'll be including will be in more detail around this space, around also what was covered in the masterclass for this first free sub. So basically what I'm saying is you'll be able to get all this information for free when you sign up for that trial. There's no credit card. So we just really, I believe it's because we can provide great value and you want to continue. So the interesting thing was the size and scale, and this was using IBM Watson Assistant. And remember, Rachel, saying at one point, that IBM has nailed it. That's what she said specifically. She's like really very, very happy. Equally, the masterclass which you covered said, and here are some challenges. You never solve every problem, so here are some things you'd like to improve. And I think one of them that stood out was that the system doesn't have version control, so if you're going to stage this content, you have to do a lot of manual copying and things like that. These are not strategic problems; they're solvable tactically. So that was a good example of one where I'm seeing it's kind of a gold standard now. If you're talking about transformation of customer services at scale, like multilingual scale, this is a really, really good example of that work. And this has been the result of multiple hours of conversations with Rachel and others to get that insight and then sort of bottle that in a view. And that's really our team's job, is to have that conversation. And in the last 2 weeks, I've had another 10 conversations of different shapes and sizes. And some of them equally, the dead ends is another important thing. When I say dead, I don't mean completely dead, but when I connect with companies, some of them are like, yeah, this is what we do. And then we agree that they can have a great story in 3 to 6 months time. And so we then schedule that and say, let's bring them into the fold when they've got a great story around this. This has already happened once when I connected with Humanized.ai, which is a company created by Duncan Anderson, the ex-CTO of IBM EMEA, who saw a great opportunity to use conversational computing to transform hospitality. And he, when I first connected with him, the story was, this is what we're doing. And then I said, well, keep in touch. And when you have a story, let's do it. And sure enough, by the time CogX in early June came along, he had a story, which was that he's getting 50% engagement of all guests using his tool, which is an extraordinary starting point for a hypothesis, a startup who's trying to transform business like that. And all these stories are very exciting. And equally, the other thing I wanted to underscore is that we treat this whole thing as a business, and therefore we're putting the discipline in terms of the quality and the structure, so that when you can digest this information, you get a good perspective on it, and it's you can focus well. So we could just stream these ideas, and I'd share quite a lot of this in my LinkedIn profile. So that's, when these insights come up and there's something useful, I will share some of that, because I think the value is really in the packaging up of it and saying, well, what does it really mean that all these pieces have happened, and what's the real output that is super useful for a particular area. So each individual interview will have about 5 or 6 different facets, like, oh, that's really interesting, about how you handled natural language generation in this case. That's interesting that this particular aspect of corporate functions has this real problem around information access. And over time, you start building this incredibly rich view on all of these things. What are you talking about before? So yeah, Autodesk is a really exciting one. I think another one that there's, let's see, we've got some that are sort of bubbling away at different levels of our development, I guess, in terms of what our conclusions are. But we have, in terms of countries, in the last 2 weeks, I've connected with hundreds of senior leaders in the chatbot space, and from all over the place. So the second message probably, I think, is that this is absolutely a global market. So I'm talking about where there are chatbot companies and products in Bosnia and Ethiopia and Egypt and Austria and Australia, of course the US, all over the world, and India, and it's really interesting because the opportunity there, you've got, like, I talked to a guy who's creating a really interesting chatbot for educating people, teaching language, and he's in Ethiopia, right? And he's like, we want to transform the world of educational institutes through chat-based language education. And this is, just, wow, that's an amazing find, right? And who on earth would expect to find that there? And he spoke perfect English, and it's like, this is quite a compelling story. So that's part of the exciting journey for me, is then you take that starting point of, oh, that's interesting, there's a connection. And, he's still developing, and the best thing for him will be to talk about his case studies in 3 to 6 months. But when you get that conversation, you start learning about, wow, there really is a global landscape, and global opportunity, and global impact.
Definitely. Now, I think for sure there is a paradigm shift occurring right now. I totally get the same thing. I'm talking to people in like Singapore and, Netherlands and the UK and all over. And it's completely fascinating, when you think about the scale of these things right now. I'm really curious, your perspective in the enterprise space, because we see a lot of these chatbots or products, that are startup stage or sort of like small SMB type messenger chatbots. Are you noticing like any distinguishing characteristics at an enterprise level that, or sort of driving successes? Because I don't think we hear as many successes at enterprise levels, as we do hear about companies experimenting, with these things at the enterprise level.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is it takes a long time for these things to happen.
Sure.
And so, and that feeds into a typical question that I'll get, which is, how much does it cost to build a chatbot? The answer is, well, it depends on the nature of how much disruption you want to have. Actually, a data point to that is that I'm doing a chatbots in business survey to get people's sentiment of what their plans are. And one of the signals that's coming through is that the majority of people are seeing chatbots as a strategic transformation of at least one business function. So that's a really interesting data point. If we look at enterprise, you've got customers and prospects, and then you've got staff and candidates, and potentially you've got partners and suppliers. And so there's a number of aspects to that. I think there's definitely a lot of stuff going on. Autodesk is the same thing. It's a enterprise transformation. It's a non-trivial company that's global, has lots of languages to deal with. That is actually a great example of that. So what else is happening? There's a number of, I'm just thinking about the B2B and the supply chain. There's definitely been interest in having chatbots being interfaces to supply chains as well. So that's something else we're seeing. And it's absolutely happening that you have projects that are, 6-7-figure enterprise projects that are making really big changes to how companies do business for customers and customer experience. That's a really big one. And then also, that's why we're focused on HR, is that the engagement with HR is very, very attractive, because it's often the first place that things are automated. So how do there's a whole bunch of standard requests about leave calculations and vacation and sick leave and all of these things. So we picked that area as well, because we're seeing not just with chatbots, but the impact of AI in terms of understanding and the real world and engaging is definitely widespread. So we're seeing another one is, the impact of when it comes to junior candidates with CV screening or resume screening, depending on what country, part of the world you're in, that's a good example of where we've got case studies of really big impact, like double-digit, massive changes in reduction in cost and increased performance and increased candidate satisfaction around that initial screening point. So we have a case study around Maya systems that had this, and these are this is a big change for large sports retailer that had used Maya for a big change in how they could process a huge number of CVs. We've seen this at larger levels too. A very large multinational company implemented an interviewing system, and it had an enormous impact on how people engage with that company. So I'm seeing that. I think the other thing to add is every enterprise solution out there that solves people's problems, customer relationship management and such like, all of those systems are likely going to have some kind of extension to their existing interface to support conversational engagement. And they'll either do that by doing it themselves. It's like Salesforce, they've got Einstein in there, which is a natural language element of their interface, a way of being able to ask a natural question if the user interface isn't quite gel with your doesn't feel like you can have that question answered. And also in Google Analytics, they've got a box where you can ask any question. And of course, it doesn't answer everything, but that kind of thing of building it into those products, and these are serious products that are used by large organizations, is starting to manifest. Banking as well, huge numbers of case studies of people taking on chatbots. There's one company in China that it's called Xiaoai, and they have implemented chatbots on 40 of the top 50 Chinese banks. Wow. China is one of the reasons I was particularly happy one of our teammates joined recently is that he speaks Chinese, and so access to the China market is really valuable to get perspective on what's really going on, because they are leading in many areas, not all, but certainly lots of insight to be gained from that area.
No, absolutely. I think those are all like very, very interesting use cases that we're like seeing across multiple segments at a like very, very high level for an enterprise perspective. Are there any like specific things the enterprises that have successful chatbot implementations are doing specifically that can sort of increase the success rate for those rollouts versus enterprises that, they try these things out and then they realize they're just hitting up against an obstacle? Because like, I hear about Autodesk and it's just like, what uniquely, did they sort of discover or do that made them a success story versus all these other companies out there trying this right now?
No, it's a great question, because you do have a lot of people who have done some exploration and now getting to the point where they look back and think, I now have to explain to my budget holders, what did we get out of the money? Which in 9 out of 10 experiments in any emerging tech will probably fail. So hopefully most people have been setting the right expectations that we learned something, but we discarded the result. But that doesn't always happen, and sometimes things get confused. And so let's assume that hasn't happened. I think the biggest challenge that any emerging technology exploration has is following the technology too far and not thinking about the benefit it might bring. And so I think the ones that get tangled up are pushing the technology towards the user rather than pulling the technology rather than the user pulling the technology towards the problems they have. So, there's 2 examples I think I'd like to talk about hypothetically. One is when it comes to natural language understanding, what I'm really saying is the pitfall is often getting technologists to try and come up with a solution when you're interfacing with people. You need to have people who are good at designing systems for people. So you need to get your design team, your user experience team trained up and start exploring in parallel the consequences of the experience that's going to change for the customers and what that brings with it. So 2 concrete sort of anti-patterns or kind of problems that have caused, may really make the difference between success and failure, I think. One is just deciding that natural language is the only way that you can interface. And so you have a chatbot where the only interface is text. So there are a number of observations around that. And if you take a user experience designer and look at that, immediately a whole lot of questions will start coming up. Mostly, what are you expecting them to type? And what's really fascinating is that when you do give an end user the opportunity to type in a box that has no constraints, they will type anything. Concrete example, this was very funny, was that a major consultancy was on a panel on my meetups recently, and he talked about how it was the process was an HR process. It wasn't particularly interesting. It was actually in depth around performance reviews, and they had a chatbot. And you just got these queries for like the weather, and they were like, "Oh, okay, well, just say, don't mess around. This is a serious process. This, is not." After 400 or 500 times, they were like, "Just give them a link to the website." So there was one of the insights was like, expect the unexpected when you have this. Now, I could go on forever about the ways of using that to your advantage. And there's actually the latent demand is an incredibly valuable part of that. But the key point is, and I've seen this even today when I saw a system and they had the prompt and it said, ask me anything. Now, that's a pretty ambitious opportunity to be given a user. So on the flip side of that, what people are doing well is if you're going to use natural language, use it in a really, really well-defined context and say, here are some variations. Now, here is one of the ideas as a sneak preview. One of the things I want to cover in the first research report is an example of where I think, and this is a hypothesis in my mind, of where you could use natural language really well with dates, because dates is my bugbear. You have an interface, and I've seen many demos of this, where the interface is, this is a great natural language system for travel here, and it says, when do you want to go? And there's a blank text box. And I just put, well, I don't know. I'll just put, don't know. And it goes, please enter a date.
Yeah.
So, but you see, I don't know about you, Chad, but when I am looking for holidays, I actually don't know. And so my experience with a travel site is lots of tabs with different dates and messing around like this. But this is a beautiful example of where a constrained experience would actually be a beautiful differentiator. Imagine if you did say, sometime in summer, and it would interpret that and say, it's these ranges. And even better is say, look, if we connect to your calendar, we can then also know really what you mean by summer, and we really know when you're actually busy on other things. But that's not quite conversational design. That's just being smart about personalization. But if you think about dealing with the specific benefit of conversation design, it's the opportunity to deal with this ambiguity in a nice way. So you could imagine, someone is going to do this, and they come up with a workshop, and they come up with 1,000 different ways that someone could ask for different vague and ambiguous ways of specifying time periods that perfectly matches the conversation you have at a travel agent. In fact, that's where I'd start. I'll go to a travel agent, I'll shadow them for a few weeks, and I'd say, wow, that's really interesting about the nature of how you settle on the dates, because no online system that I personally know of, and maybe some of these chatbots are doing this now, but certainly last time I checked, it didn't exist. And so you had this incredibly obstructive interface that is literally, I actually wrote a post about this a couple of years ago saying the worst chatbots take us back to the dark ages of command line interfaces, because they're worse than a wizard. I mean, because you can't even go back. So if you're sitting there and one chatbot I typed, where do you want to go? And it was, I want to go to, Manchester. And it's like, okay, so when do you want to go? And I was like, no, actually I don't want to go to Manchester, but I was thinking I want to go to Leeds. So make that Leeds. Invalid date, right? Right. That. And you know what? If you just had an interface, we could click something. Sometimes it works, right? Okay. Now, I'm completely glossing over the tantalizing and most interesting thing that people are super excited about this year, which is voice. Where voice is like, you can't really have that choice. You do need to have a conversation. But then one of the outcomes that I really got from the future chatbot session that I held in the CognitionX, and again in the show notes we can link to that panel. We had Lauren Kunze from PandoraBot's largest chatbot builder creator in the world, and we had William Tunstall-Pitto, who created Alexa, on the panel amongst a number of other specialists, which was great. One of the key insights there was that voice in its isolation should be the starting point, but it's inevitable that visual augmentation is going to be an essential part of that, because our eyes are actually pretty good at consuming stuff. You don't want a list of things read out to you. Amazon does an admirable job on that. But ultimately, if you want 10 things in a list, you just want to see that list. And you blink of an eye, you've read them and digested. But if you have a list where they say it, it's just tedious. And so on that frontier, I think there's a really good opportunity around voice. But we're really in early days across all of that with voice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's the thing that I'm super excited about too, just having these multimodality experiences, because I'm sure you see this right now, especially with voice. Buying like commoditized products like toilet paper or soap is it's a good experience. But if I'm trying to buy clothes on a voice only user interface, it's very bad, right? But when you add a screen to that, the use cases begin to expand, and it's just like this expansion of opportunities with conversational commerce. That's why I think, Amazon's, I think Alexa look is actually very interesting. You know, it's the camera attached to that. Now it's looking and giving you style tips. And, you know, I think that is actually going to take these things very far. But almost right now, you know, back to your point about, you know, when to use NLP specifically and only, or interjecting, you know, web views or whatever, you know, I think just defining that interplay first, right, is a necessity before we can really have really good multi-channel and multimodal experiences almost. I'm definitely very excited for that. So switching gears just a little bit, you know, what are like the current obstacles or challenges in this space that you've seen so far that a lot of people are struggling with, or are challenges that need to be solved before we can get to this next sort of idealized level of voice and chat?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm actually going to steal a page from a recent paper IBM presented on this, which said that in many ways, the way we're dealing with conversational computing is a bit like where the web was back in 1996. So there aren't really any good best practices to lean on, and therefore customers don't really have a good background of expectation about how to interface with things. Now, so William Tulswell-Petter, who was the one who created Alexa, his view is that voice is the most natural interface because it's the one that we're born with, and it's the one that's easiest for us to work with. And that, I think, resonates really well. And therefore, while I think we've hit a sweet spot with understanding, and I think I first saw that with Google Now, the ability for it to understand what I said, and it's was extraordinary. And it's some years ago now. I think we really have hit a point where it's basically understanding me almost all the time, and that's really, really good. So that's kind of a sweet spot on that dimension. When it comes to how we interact with no cues, or how you set the context so those cues are helpful, it's really a design space best practice that we need to explore and need to establish. I remember getting very excited about the first web usability book, which I think was 99 by Jared Spall. That was like gold. You know, finally we have a reference point for how to design web apps using, you know, within the constraints of web pages. We need something like that for voice. And, you know, so we got Kathy Pearl's book on voice user interfaces and a couple others I read recently. And if anyone has any more, I will digest those quickly. It's very exciting stuff and has some really good fundamental pieces like, you know, just be really honest about whether you're a human or a bot, and, you know, this kind of thing. So there's some axiomatic components which you say, yeah, this is the principles that we should apply. And these are points upon which interfaces then gain traction. You go, and of course, no one's ever always going to follow this. There's still a lot of rubbish web pages out there. But when you're looking to provide a great experience, you look at cart experience, look at the vocabulary in a specific domain, that's just not really developed. And the thing that's going to take the time, and we're going to need patience, it's not just us coming up with ideas. It's then socializing those ideas with your audience, who then has that institutional expectation of that kind of behavior. You know, the way that we use our phones and the way we swipe and all that stuff has been, someone came up with the idea, tested it with some people, and over time, people all start coming to expect that behavior. That if you gave someone a phone with no buttons on it, and you gave it to someone 20 years ago, they would have absolutely no idea what to do. They would literally not know what to do, because they would get lost and they wouldn't really know what those conventions are. So that's one of the big obstacles, is that it's an ecosystem transformation that will carry through and be led by some people. That's the first point, I think. Yeah.
No, yeah, I totally agree with all your sentiments there. You know, I think you're right. I think a lot of the best practices haven't really bubbled up yet, but, you know, in a way it's like people haven't had enough time to fail yet. Right. And I think in those moments of failure, we begin to piece together like what is going to work and what's not going to work. I'm really curious, actually. So you said that book on sort of best practices for web applications, how long, like what was the duration of time that took place before that book actually came out?
Well, that was 99, I think.
Oh.
And so I started doing web development 95, I think. Mm-hmm. So I created the University of Auckland's first intranet. And that was, you know, just writing HTML on a web page. That was, you know, just simple, very basic stuff. And So I think, yeah, it's a good question around that how long it might take for us to come with best practices. There's two things that we need to bear in mind. Well, back then, things happening at internet speed was very much to a very exclusive audience. To put things in perspective, my first academic conference, which was in 1994, I went to Vancouver and it was all very exciting. And I was going around, this is academics, right? And I went around and I said, let's keep in touch. And here's my email address. And then I looked at it and like, well, here's my address. And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm like, no, I prefer you write me a letter. And I'm like, what?
Yeah.
And that was like, because I'd, been working in the computer science department and I was familiar with this stuff for some time. That was where we were. It was just, there was no real access to that. And so now there's such an incredible ability to access information. The speed at which we're institutionally learning is rapid. But the end users are, and maybe the end users are moving more quickly too. I think there's a lot of people who are not changing their phones every year and things. So I do think things will be faster. And if it's a leading question to when do we think we'll see these practices, then we're seeing a couple of things in the space already. One is, we've got some good books, and I do recommend Kathy's book, O'Reilly. It's so digestible. It's really, really great. And although it's just voice interfaces, it all applies to text. The only thing you need to bear in mind is that text is actually slightly easier, so you can get away with some of those things. And then we've got like Hans van Dam, who in fact you interviewed, and that's in fact how I met him, was on your podcast. So he presented at our masterclass in London, and he's creating an academy on how to design things and what that vocabulary is. So leaders like Hans, who are coming through and saying, stake in the ground, these are the principles you need to apply that are proven and well established through all of these examples, are, those signals suggest that I would say, what are people going to be taught in this space as an expectation? Then I'd say it is years away, but I would say you'll probably start seeing a lot more attraction and more expectation and best practice emerging in the next couple of years. And probably within the next 12 months, I imagine there's going to be a lot of conferences talking about that best practice and insights around that.
Cool. No, I think speaking of best practices, can you share like any best practices or insights that you've sort of learned through your own experience or through talking to other people so far?
Well, I think the first one is, I'll dip into my experience on the weekend, which was, so I have a 7-year-old, and he's at a point where I want to encourage him to develop his maths. So we had this sparring thing where I'll give him numbers, and then I was like, wait a second, I can make an Alexa skill out of this. And so the first thing I did, I'm a technologist, right? So the first thing I leapt towards the tools. And then the product manager hat came in and going, what are you doing? You don't even know what you're designing. This is why I like distinguishing between conversation design and conversation development, because you do the development once you have a design. And it's not waterfall. It's literally, I have no interface in the world was going to help me understand, other than a Google sheet, of actually what is the story I'm creating. So in the end, the morning was very productive, because what I did was I thought, and I was learning from actually an ex-Googler mate of mine, Adam Banks, he runs a UX testing service in London, and he has a little UX as a box, and he's got, for voice testing, has a little box, and the little box is a simulated assistant. And so you do Wizard of Oz. So that's the thing I really want everyone to think about, is Wizard of Oz. Test it. Wizard of Oz is a term which means you present the experience as if it were real, but under the hood, it's just people pretending to be a robot, which in itself actually is a skill. But it's assuming you can constrain yourself. So I'll go through this to give a really good example of this. So first of all, I was like, let's get all these tools. And then I was like, well, that doesn't work. Spreadsheet. First item, what is it? And I want to be given a question of, plus or minus with these numbers. That's what I want. Great. Okay. That's a pretty good starting point. And so I was like, how do I simulate that? Because the other thing I learned from Adam and his experience of voice testing is, you need to have an experience that's representative of your environment. So in the case of voice, I need a voice box, and having a person there gets in the way of the experience, because they're relating to you, unavoidably biasing the experience. So I didn't have a voice box, and I will get one, and I'll talk to Adam and catch up. But I had something closer to constrain the experience. So I went online and looked for these soundboards. So these soundboards, they're just like an app, and you just have buttons and click, 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 and it just creates sounds. So I was like, record me saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, plus, minus, negative, correct, incorrect. I created this audio script, and I got my son over, and I was like, let's get started. What's your name? He's like, Misha. Okay. What is 1 plus 2? And he'd be like, 1 plus, incorrect. And I was like, no, that was immediately insight, because he was vocalizing the question, and I knew that my software was listening for a numeric answer. And so I was like, whoa, I learned straight away that I'm gonna have to deal with, kids vocalizing the question instead of answering it. And because of course it's like, no, that's not what I meant. And I'm like, okay, fine. So learn something from there. So within a short period of time, I learned something that you could have never imagined, except with a real user, that interaction. So I learned like 3 or 4 like big things from an incredibly cheap test of a voice experience. And so my real advice is that depending on whether it's voice or text, just creating a situation that simulates that experience first before you touch any technology is gold. You'll learn so much, and what you'll do as well is you're then armed with being able to create a better product. But those who experience that, their eyes will be opened, because if you've not gone through that process, you will make all sorts of assumptions that are completely tied to your experience in the past. And humans have this great ability to digest and conceptualize incredibly sophisticated things, and then suddenly see it all as very simple. But that's not necessarily the experience of someone else. So when my 7-year-old was doing this, he had a different experience, and that's what you're testing, not your own assumptions around. And this is fundamental user experience design. Right. But a concrete example of how most of those principles transfer really well in a slightly different environment with different tools and a different kind of world. So for those who are doing user experience design or service design, this is a differential on, that you'll gain good experience from to move to being able to have confidence in designing in that space. So repeating it again, the real message is, test your designs without even using any technology, so that you understand what those conversations actually look like, what kinds of things people will say. And they won't get all of it for sure, but it's going to give you strategic insight into the viability of your product and the scope of the product and the kinds of conversations that you will do. And it may be that you fail early and you spend half a day trying that and going, wow, that was completely insane. I had no idea that I'd do that. Versus saying, I do these 2 things, I prioritize this, and now I've got something I can develop and I can start testing, which I plan to do in the coming weeks.
No, I love it. I think that's like a very, very practical approach that I don't hear enough people talking about in the space, right? Because I think, for whatever reason, it's like there's new technology, so we need to think about this entirely different. But, at the same time, there are principles that are relevant for every single technology or designing and developing it that I think we need to begin to apply. Similarly, what I see in addition to what you're saying, which is sort of like this validated learning approach, I think people need to more so understand their audience with these chatbots, right? What is the persona of people that are actually going to use that, right? Because it's just like for your son, he's verbalizing these things out, but for an adult that's using it, they'll probably just, think about it and say it, right? So I think, it's like taking all these interdiscipline skill sets, and that's ultimately what this comes down to. So I think, without rambling too much, team composition and identifying, we need a copywriter here and we need someone that understands UX here is this evolving and emerging thing that I'm sure you're seeing quite a lot.
Yeah, I think it's a nice way of summarizing it. Yeah, knowing your user and trying to actually test early and often. And the new tools, as I say, are coming out that will provide guidance. And a lot of them are free. The ones that have real substance will come with some kind of commercial component. And that's just how it is, because they're high value and they're distilled insight from years of experimentation.
Yeah, definitely. I guess I have a really interesting question. Have you used any chatbots or voice bots that you actually personally thought were good?
Yeah, so there's actually lots. There's one I particularly like, which is if we look at where there's really a lot of success. I think we're seeing a lot of development in banking. We're having a lot of success in sports, media, and entertainment. And what's also surprising to me is around the space of well-being and social companionship. So there's some amazing stuff going on when it comes to just pure companionship, like Microsoft Shower Ice and such like. They're doing extraordinary things. The one that I want to talk very briefly on that I think is interesting and probably not that well known is actually another kind of chatbot. Because if we think about the way in which we interface with chatbots, there's actually a bunch of different ways. So you can have a human-first chatbot system where you're interacting with a person who then pulls in information that a bot can augment their abilities with. Or you can have bot-first where it's always a bot and they route through to a person if that's needed. But we're also seeing other patterns where you have what I call a coach bot, which is an observation of a behavior, but not an interjection. So they're watching the conversation. Two examples of that are ICSI and Cogito in different contexts. They're systems that are observing what happened and say, this is the language you used, this is the sentiment your counterpart had, and here's some guidance. So you can see it as chat in that it's observing the conversation and giving you contextual and natural language guidance. Then the third is what I call a broker bot, which is you're actually brokering between people. So I think this is why I've actually found this very helpful. There's a site called Coco. It's coco.com. This is a broker bot. So what I was impressed about is that it's got a really good sentiment detection. And the principle of Coco is that it helps people who are with their well-being. So if you're feeling like you are upset or you feel like even a point of potential self-harm, then Coco is an interesting place because it anonymizes interactions between people. And so the experience of someone going to Coco is that it's a Facebook Messenger app, and it comes and says, you have a feeling, or would you like to say something about how you feel, or would you like to help someone? If you say I want to help someone, then it says, here is a statement, and it'll be someone. And the statement, it could be anything, and you can respond in any way, obviously. And they have signals. So if there's an indication of self-harm, then you can press a button and say, this looks bad. It has detection of that on your site too, but if you think this looks like a really dangerous situation, then you can say, click the button going, this person needs help. And they will get a message saying, here are some contact points for you in your location. So that's a nice safety net. And I actually think that this idea of a self-harm safety net should be available in every single environment. So that's one of my missions, is to have that possible. That is like a free open source place where everyone can have that drop in. So if anyone indicates that in any conversation, it becomes easy to support and guide them to the right place. That'd be a nice thing to do. But in this experience, the nice thing is that there's an opportunity to get feedback. So, I'll say, it's often through a relatedness. So like, hey, when I've been in this situation, this is how I felt, and blah, blah, blah. And then sometimes, quite often, they'll come back and say, that really made my day and that was really helpful. You have no idea who they are. There's no personally identifiable information. You have no idea where they are. Or the only thing I know is that they speak English. And that was it. And even then it was written, so I didn't even know who they are or anything. And there's something safe about that. And I think there's definitely an emerging trend of bots providing, in a strange way, robots providing a safe place for people. People tend to trust bots more. And so that's a very exciting one, which hopefully also helps people understand that the way that we're interacting with computers, there's not just you and bot. There's actually 4 or 5 different ways that people are doing that, and they're all producing very, very interesting new opportunities.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's, good context for a lot of people who are only seeing bots as like, this is an automated computer system and that's it. But, like to your point, we're seeing really incredible models like with Sensei and with Swelly and Coco, it sounds like as well, which are, definitely sort of, playing this new type of model that I think is really interesting, especially on that messenger platform, just connecting people in sort of the social network, but being like this, like robot, as you said, that's making those connections with people. So I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, there's one word I wanted to add there, which was that I just learned today that in terms of taxonomies, that's called pre-primary healthcare. So that whole space is the space which is before you end up going to an institution, and hopefully no one ever goes to an institution with these safety nets to prevent or guide it with these early signals.
That's fascinating. New buzzwords are emerging every day in this field, so that's always cool. That's always really cool. Before we conclude the podcast, I always like to ask this question to all of our guests. What is it that like keeps you motivated and inspired? Just in general or specifically in this space?
Well, I alluded to that at the beginning, and I'm happy to spend a bit more time on it. I mean, really, I've always been interested in how people can benefit from computers. So the thing that lights me up is it's a new frontier. There's a new way of creating things that never existed before. So I feel like, in many respects, designing computer software is like a continuous Wild West, where it's just a new place to explore. All the technologies that are coming along, so many of them are just incredibly interesting because they provoke a new way of thinking or open to a new possibility. So I think I'm most happy and fulfilled when I'm exploring that frontier and seeing an opportunity to use it in a way that no one's ever done before.
Oh, I love it. I love it. At that, Julian, appreciate your time. I definitely look up to what you're doing and, all the stuff in the ecosystem that you're helping to facilitate. And, I feel like we could probably stay on this podcast and probably talk for another 3 hours, but we'll definitely have you back in the future. And I definitely look forward to, playing around with the platform when it's released. So appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thanks for your time, Chad. I think your questions are great. And I really felt like, really, really appreciate your time as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
See you later.